Abraham took another wife, or had taken another wife, whose name was Keturah. She bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Jokshan was the father of Sheba and Dedan. The descendants of Dedan were the Asherites, the Letushites, and the Leumites. The sons of Midian were Ephah, Epher, Hanok, Abida, and Ediah. All these were descendants of Keturah. We'll see the Midianites. I don't know about some of these other names, but the Midianites will be players in the story in the future. So Abraham had plenty of sons. In addition to Isaac, he also had Ishmael, and he had these 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So the problem with having a son wasn't Abraham. He was capable of having sons. It was Sarah. Sarah was the limiting factor in their reproductive problems for all those years. Abraham left everything he owned to Isaac. But while he was still living, he gave gifts to the sons of his concubines and sent them away from his son Isaac to the land of the east. And they're going to become enemies, of course, naturally. They all do. They're not the chosen one. They're not the promised son, so they will all end up becoming enemies. That essentially is the story of the entire Old Testament. Those who aren't the chosen one will end up becoming hostile to that one, the one who is. Altogether, Abraham lived 175 years. Then Abraham breathed his last and died at a good old age, an old man and full of years. And he was gathered to his people. Remember back in Genesis 5, when we read those paragraphs of all those people who lived 800, 900 years, and we talked about those age limits and all that, and they had their sons and daughters, and there was one son that we focused on to go to the next. But the key phrase in all of those paragraphs wasn't the ages, the 930 or the 969 or the whatever it was. The key phrase was always those 4 last words, and then he died. And it happens to all of them. And it happens to Abraham here. Abraham breathed his last and died. Even Abraham dies. There comes a point in the story, even with Abraham, we read, and then he died. And he was gathered to his people. This is the closest we're going to come to any hint of an afterlife in all the works of Moses. And I'm not even sure if that's what it's hinting at. That may just be an expression. That may just, I don't know exactly what that thought communicates. Again, we read about all those other people who had died before Abraham. It may just be a reference and now he's like them. He's not buried with them. He's buried in that cave where Sarah is. So he is not physically gathered with them because they're not buried in the same location. So there could be a hint of an afterlife, or at least a concept of one, or a hope of one. But that's it. If you're looking for a hint of an afterlife in the works of Moses, that's as close as you're going to come. It's not any, and God hasn't told them that he's going to do that for them yet. So if that is communicated in that thought, that would be more of a wish on the part of the writer than anything else at this point in time. His sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him in the cave of Machpelah, near Mamre. So Ishmael came back for this, apparently. In the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite. That's a place that Abraham had purchased. The field Abraham had bought from the Hittites. There Abraham was buried with his wife Sarah. After Abraham's death, God blessed his son Isaac, who then lived near Beer Lahai Roi. So that's the end of the account of Terah, the family records of Terah, which is really the story of Abraham. This is the account of Abraham's son Ishmael, whom Sarah's maidservant Hagar, the Egyptian, bore to Abraham. These are actually this is the family records of Abraham's son Ishmael. These are the names of the sons of Ishmael, listed in the order of their birth. Nebaioth, whatever, the firstborn of Ishmael, Keter, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Temer, Jeter, Naphish, and Kedemah. These are the sons of Ishmael. These are the names of the 12 tribal rulers according to their settlements and camps. Altogether, Ishmael lived 137 years. He breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people. So he was gathered to his people too, as was Abraham. His descendants settled in the area from Havilah to Shur, near the border of Egypt as you go toward Ashur, and they lived in hostility towards all their brothers. Or they lived to the east of all their brothers, which means living in hostility, because east is the direction the bad people come from. The bad people go to the east, because they can't go anywhere else. You go to the west and you'll end up in the Mediterranean Sea. This is the account of Abraham's son, Isaac. Actually, it's going to be about Jacob and Esau. Abraham became the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel the Aramean, from Paddan Aram, and sister of Laban the Aramean. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren. This is the second generation in a row where we have the chosen man marrying a barren woman. Abraham did so, and now so does Isaac. But they're not going to have, at least we're not going to have a record of them having the same trouble that Abraham and Sarah did. The Lord answered his prayer. That didn't take, how many chapters did it take for Abraham and Sarah to finally have Isaac? 8 chapters, I think. We go from chapter 12, where they first show up, and then Isaac is finally born, I believe, in 20 or 21, so 9 chapters-ish. This one happened in one verse. The Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. The babies jostled each other within her, so she has 2 of them in there. And she asked, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. I don't know how she did this. Normally, you get the impression when the wife wanted to inquire of the Lord, she went through her husband. In this case, I don't think that's necessarily true, because I'm not sure if Isaac is aware of the statement that God is going to say to Rebekah here. But I don't know in general. It's hard for me to visualize or conceptualize how these people did this in this time period anyway. It's weird to me. I mean, I understand the concept of prayer, but it's weird to me to just be able to go and inquire of the Lord and then he just answers. Like, that's, I don't know how that happened. I don't know how they did that. It's just like, so she has a question, why is this happening to me? So she asks the Lord, and the Lord tells her. It's like, I wish it was that easy. I wish I could do that today. I wish I could ask the God a question, and he just tells me the answer. I don't understand that. I don't know how that would have happened. It seems as though God preferred to speak to the patriarchs of these family clans. In this case, I'm not sure if he did, because I don't know if Isaac is aware of this prophecy that God is giving here. But I don't know. It's just a mystery to me in general. So the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger, so the younger will be the stronger. When the time came for her to give birth, there were 2 boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment. It was a hairy baby. So they named him Esau. Esau may mean hairy. He was also called Edom, which means red. That's a footnote in the bottom of the page, by the way. After this, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel. So he was named Jacob. So they were wrestling with each other all the way up until the moment of their birth. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to him. So they tried to get pregnant for 20 years before it finally happened, because they got married when he was 40. The boys grew up, and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was a quiet man, staying among the tents. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, and may have been something of a man of the field himself, because we saw him out in the field when he first meets Rebekah. So he may have been something of a hunter or a wild man himself. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob, because he was a quiet, domesticated son. Once, when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the open country, famished. So he had exhausted himself on a hunt, probably, and needed some energy right away. He said to Jacob, "Quick, let me have some of that red stew. I'm famished." This is why he was also called Edom, which means red. Jacob replied, "First, sell me your birthright." "Look, I'm about to die," Esau said. "What good is the birthright to me?" The birthright is his right to the double portion of the inheritance. As the older, he has that by default. The firstborn son gets that by default. Jacob wanted that. That's why he was grasping the heel even as a baby coming out of the womb. Jacob, by the way, means, as we see in our notes down here, he grasps the heel. Or figuratively, he deceives. So Jacob was always scheming up a way to get the birthright away from Esau, who had it by virtue of being born first. "Look, I'm about to die," Esau said. "What good is the birthright to me?" But Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore an oath to him, selling his birthright to him. Then Jacob gave Esau some bread and some lentil stew. He ate and drank, and then got up and left. So Esau despised his birthright. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and finish there for the night. I've got a few more minutes before I turn off the video. There's an interesting pattern. I'm going to go ahead and mention it here. This is as good a place as any. I've been meaning to bring this up when it was appropriate, and I feel like this is as good. We're pretty much halfway through the book of Genesis. What are we in? Yeah. At the end of 25, there's 50 chapters in Genesis. We're going to go through the end of the lifetime of Jacob's son, Joseph. And we're at the beginning of Jacob's life right now, so it's a good time to stop. But there's an interesting pattern in the book of Genesis that's playing out here in the historical narrative that is unfolding over generations, which I think God is. Excuse me. Oh, wow. Which I think God is using to try to communicate a subtle message to people. Although I don't think anybody at this day and time, I don't think any of the people of that day and time are getting it at all. But see, mentioning Esau and Jacob, okay, Esau had the birthright by virtue of being born first. He had the blessing. He was in store to get the blessing. There's two different things here, the birthright and the blessing, okay? Jacob has just swindled Esau out of the birthright. He'll eventually swindle him out of the blessing. These are two different things. The birthright is his right to the double portion of the inheritance. He has that by simply by virtue of being born first. Okay, that is Esau's by right of coming out of the womb first, and that was a big deal in their culture, and I would say it still is. Maybe not as big a deal in our culture today, but there is still, I think, always has been and still is to this day, an emphasis on the firstborn son, firstborn in general, but especially the firstborn son. I'm not a firstborn son, by the way. I'm a middle. I'm number 2 out of 3 sons. I'm number 3 out of 4 total. The oldest one of us actually was a daughter. So she's number 1, and the first son was number 2, and I'm number 3 and number 2 in the sons. So I'm a middle child. I have another son after me, a younger brother. So I never, I'm not the firstborn son. I never had that position of being the firstborn son, or the firstborn in general. Even the firstborn son in our family wasn't actually the firstborn. But anyway. There is an emphasis on the firstborn son. There still is even to this day, and there certainly was back then. But what's interesting in Genesis is that it's never the firstborn son who actually ends up receiving the blessing. Cain was older than Abel, and Abel was the one who was supposed to get the blessing. Of course, Cain killed him, and then Seth does. Shem, as far as I can tell, was not the firstborn of Noah. Shem is the chosen one of Noah's 3 sons, but I think Japheth was the oldest. Ishmael was actually the firstborn of Abraham. Now that one is a little bit different because it was a son born of another woman, not the woman that was supposed to be. He only ever had one son with the princess, with Sarah. Jacob was not the firstborn son of Isaac. Joseph and Judah are not the firstborn sons of Jacob. Judah is the one who ends up receiving the blessing at the end of Genesis. Of course, the son of primary importance ends up being Joseph, and he's near the very back of the list. Judah is number 4. Even with Joseph, he's got 2 sons, and the firstborn of his sons is not the one who ends up receiving the blessing from Jacob. So there is a constant pattern going on here all throughout the book of Genesis, that despite man's attempts to put the emphasis on the literal firstborn son, like the literal firstborn, the one who comes out first, that it's never actually the firstborn son who receives the blessing, who ends up receiving the blessing. I'll do that in a minute. But anyway, the point is that as much emphasis as man puts on the firstborn son, still in our culture today, but especially true in this culture back that day, God, up to throughout the book of Genesis, never chooses the firstborn son. So, as someone who is not actually a firstborn son, that pleases me. It's like there's nothing you can actually do about the order in which you're born. Okay, it's like you have no control over that. I have no control over not being the firstborn son. There's nothing whatsoever that I could do about that. If I were living at this point in time, it's like there's nothing I could have done. I mean, I could kill my older brother. Like if I was living in a system where the son who came out first literally is, by virtue of coming out first, going to get twice as much as I'm going to get, I could just kill my brother and take that position from him. Like that would be the only thing I could do. That I wouldn't have any other method of control or influence over that. But, and you can see it all, even Joseph, who should know a thing or two about not being the firstborn son, since he was near the back of the list, even Joseph is disturbed when Jacob ends up blessing his younger son first. So it really was imprinted deep into their culture, but consistently, over and over, God overturns that expectation and chooses his chosen one by different criteria. And we're going to see that, and that's just something that I think we could look at, and I see it as a message that God is trying to communicate to the people, not necessarily through words, not necessarily by preaching at them, but by showing consistently, demonstrating over and over the course of generations and centuries, that his favorite doesn't necessarily match up with what we judge our favorites by. That's one of those lessons I think he's teaching people by example rather than by word. Another example, and we'll get into this more as we go through the Old Testament, is polygamy. The practice of taking multiple wives. Abraham had Sarah as his wife. He took another wife after she died. And then he had the whole thing with Hagar, which caused problems. So that was actually at Sarah's suggestion. Abraham himself didn't really practice polygamy, except for that instance with Hagar, because he didn't take Keturah as a wife until after Sarah had died. But his sons will. I mean, Jacob will be forced to be tricked into doing it. Jacob doesn't necessarily want to take multiple women as wives. He ends up doing so, though. And we're going to see constantly, that this never ends up working. This the multiple wife household does not end up resulting in a stable household. And this is another area, another issue, which I think God was letting humans discover by example, rather than by actually telling them not to do this. He allowed them to do it and fail at it. And by virtue of that example, David will end up taking multiple wives, and that does not turn out well for him. And it will turn out even worse for his son Solomon. So I think the examples that, in some instances, even when God does not explicitly forbid something by a word or command, by allowing something to happen and then showing the repeated failure of that something, you definitely can get the teaching or get the understanding that this is something that we are not supposed to do. He prescribed marriage as being one-on-one. He didn't forbid them from marrying multiple partners, but every example we have of it happening in the scriptures ends up being a negative one. So, and again, the emphasis on the firstborn son here, God is constantly choosing someone who is not actually the firstborn to work with as his chosen one. So that's another area where I think God is trying to teach mankind a lesson by an example, not necessarily by saying it in a command or an instruction.